පෑස් චූටි පැක් රුපියල් 37ක වාසියක් දැන් රුපියල් 145යි.
හරිම සුළුයි.
Tonight on First at 9, this Wednesday, the 25th of January 2023. Status quo. Central Bank of Sri Lanka makes no changes to monetary policy rates. CBSL chief says there is progress between IMF and creditors, but more needs to be done with the Paris Club and China.
Paris Club and China and some other small collaterals are also in the process of issuing financial instruments. So there have been significant communications that has been happening.
Fair treatment. Sri Lankan ambassador in Beijing to respond to controversies surrounding outstanding Sri Lankan debt to China. Close friends. Cooperation and working together would be very important for Sri Lanka and India on the journey forward, says Indian High Commissioner to Sri Lanka. National consensus. President to convene first all-party conference for 2023.
From AdaDerana, this is AdaDerana First at 9 with Indivadi Amawata. Live from Studio 24 in Colombo.
And a warm welcome. We'll take you to your top story tonight. While the International Monetary Fund is satisfied with the assurances provided by India over restructuring Sri Lanka's debt, Central Bank Governor Dr. Nandalal Veerasinghe says there is significant communication and progress being made between the IMF and Paris Club members as well as China. Although it is too early to respond to how domestic debt restructuring will roll out, the central bank chief said they are looking at easing the potential risk banks could face during the process. Speaking during the first monetary policy review for the year, Dr. Veerasinghe added that the banking system currently is capable of issuing funds necessary for the importation of essentials such as pharmaceuticals, gas and other items, and that the regulator would only intervene if the banking system is unable to fulfill the requirement.
The monetary policy of the central bank decided to maintain the standing deposit facility rate and the standing lending facility rate of the central bank at their current levels of 14.5% and 15.5% respectively. Accordingly, the CBSL was of the view that the maintenance of the prevailing tight monetary policy stance is imperative to ensure that monetary conditions remain sufficiently tight to rein in inflationary pressures and bring it down to the desired levels by 2023 end, restoring economic and price stability over the medium term.
Can you explain where we are on financing assurances situation?
India has clearly given financial assurances which is acceptable to the International Monetary Fund. That is very clear. The other bilateral creditors, Paris Club and China and some other small bilateral creditors are also in the process of issuing financial assurances. There have been significant communications that has been happening between the IMF, between the Paris Club and other non-Paris Club members, and also with the Minister of Finance. That process is making a very good progress. In fact, the issuing financial assurance is a matter between the creditors and the IMF. What is expected is that creditors will issue this letter to the IMF in line with their debt targets. Then IMF will have to look at it and make a decision. These assurances are sufficient for them to go ahead with the IMF board approval.
Are there any contingency plans in case domestic debt restructuring is done to exclude the banks or recapitalize the banks?
We are basically looking at each bank by one potential risks that they could face going forward in terms of the rising NPLs and the interest rates impact, exchange rate impact, and that there is going to be a pressure stress on the capital liquidity. That's why we have introduced several schemes. First, to address the support liquidity if there is any need in the short term, that we have introduced several schemes. And going forward, that's why one of the exercises we are doing asset quality review for us to understand the kind of stress if banks are going to face in the future, and then based on the assessment we can basically work with the bank and come out with recommendation how to deal with that.
The governor further went on to say that the central bank stopped issuing dollars from January this year to the CB, CPC and other institutions likewise, as the banking system has the necessary dollar inflows available at the moment to meet their requirements.
පහුගිය කාලේ මහ බැංකුව අර විදේශ විනිමය liquid reserves කියන එක ඉතාම අඩු ප්‍රමාණයක් තියෙන කාලෙදී අපේ ක්‍රමවේදයක් තිබුණා බැංකු වලින් export remittances export proceeds වලින් 25% අපට අරගෙන ඒක අත්‍යවශ්‍ය දේවල් වලට පමණක් යොමු කරන්න ඊට අමතරව බැංකු වලට අපි කියලා තිබ්බා ඒවට අවශ්‍ය පුළුවන් තරම් ප්‍රමුඛතාවය දෙන කල අත්‍යවශ්‍ය දේවල් වලට ඒ ක්‍රමය තමයි පහුගිය කාලේ තුල ක්‍රියාත්මක කළ පස්සේ දෙසැම්බර් මාසෙ විතර ඉඳලා අපි දැක්කා ඉස්සර මං කිව්ව විදිහට යම්කිසි improvement එකක් තිබිච්ච නිසා විදේශ විනිමය ලැබීම බැංකු ක්‍රමය තුලට අපි කියලා තිබ්බා අපි විසින් මැදිහත් වෙලා විදේශ විනිමය කෙලින්ම ඒ අත්‍යවශ්‍ය දේවල් දීම වෙනුවට අපි කියලා දෙනවා CPC එකට ගෑස් වලට හවුස් වලට අත්‍යවශ්‍ය දේවල් වලට පුළුවන් තරම් බැංකු වල දැන් වැඩිපුර තියෙනවා ඒවා ලබා ගන්න. එහෙනම් බලන්න බැරුණොත් විතරක් අපේ තියෙන ඒවා දෙන්නම් කියලා. ඉතින් ඒක තමයි දැන් යන ක්‍රමය. ජනවාරි මාසයේ ඉඳලා අත් වශයෙන් අපි බැලුවා දෙසැම්බර් සහ ජනවාරි මේ කාලය තුල පේ සංචිත වලින් කම්පෙයාර් කරනකොට ඒ අත්‍යවශ්‍ය දේවල් දෙන ප්‍රමාණය ක්‍රමයෙන් අඩුලා තියෙනවා. මොකද හේතුලා තියෙන්නේ බැංකු වලින් ඒකට හොයාගන්න පුළුවන් ඒ ප්‍රමාණය. ඒතකොට අපේ වගකීම තියෙන හැමතිස්සෙම යම් කිසි ආකාරයක අත්‍යවශ්‍ය දේවල් වලට අවශ්‍ය විදේශ විනිමය බැංකු ක්‍රමය තුළ සොයා ගන්න නොහැකි නම් එතකොට අපි යම් කිසි ආකාරයක මැදිහත් වෙලා ඒ අවශ්‍ය ප්‍රමාණය ලබා දෙන්න අපේ වගකීමක් තියෙනවා. අපි ඒක දිගටම කරගෙන යනවා. ඒක තමයි ඉස්සරහටත් කරගෙන යන්නේ. ඉතින් අපිට දැන් පේන විදිහට එහෙම විදේශ විනිමය පැත්තෙන් ලොකු හිගයක් බැංකු ක්‍රමය තුළ නැහැ.
Well, leaders of all political parties in Parliament have been invited to attend the all-party conference held under the patronage of President Ranil Wickremesinghe. Now, the meeting follows the first all-party conference on the 13th of December, following the President's appointment.
An all-party conference under the patronage of President Ranil Wickremesinghe is scheduled to be held tomorrow at 4 p.m. onwards at the Presidential Secretariat. Party leaders from all political parties in Parliament are expected to be present at the meeting. According to official sources, the aim of the conference will be to arrive at a consensus and strengthen national harmony. The Speaker of Parliament, the Prime Minister, the Leader of the Opposition, former Presidents Mahinda Rajapaksa and Maithripala Sirisena, Tamil National Alliance Leader R. Sampanthan, Jatika Jana Balawege Leader Anurukumara Dissanayaka and all other party leaders in Parliament have been invited. Following President Ranil Wickremesinghe's appointment as President, a meeting of party leaders was called on the 13th of December where the program to improve national harmony was first discussed. It is expected during tomorrow's meeting of party leaders to discuss these issues further and reach an agreement.
Now, the Constitutional Council will call for applications from those interested and qualified to be appointed as members of independent commissions. The decision was made at its inaugural meeting today.
The Constitutional Council met today under the patronage of Council Chairman Speaker Mahinda Abeyewardene and unanimously agreed to discharge duties and functions of the Council in an independent, accountable and transparent manner. A newspaper advertisement will be published calling for the applications from those interested and qualified to be appointed as members of the independent commissions. The Communication Department of the Parliament confirmed 2 weeks will be given from the date of the advertisement to furnish all related applications, adding that more details about the application process will be notified through the newspaper advertisement. The advertisement is due to be published calling for new members to the Election Commission, Delimitation Commission, National Police Commission, Audit Service Commission, Human Rights Commission, National Procurement Commission, Finance Commission and Bribery Commission after the Constitutional Council gives the go-ahead to the recommendations made by the President for the positions of the chairpersons and members of several independent commissions. The meeting also focused on the future activities of the Council along with its mandate as stipulated in the Constitution and the other laws.
Minister of Foreign Affairs Ali Sabri has discussed the prospects for enhancing cooperation between the Organization of Islamic Cooperation and Sri Lanka. Sabri, currently in Saudi Arabia for an official visit, called on the Secretary General of OIC, Hussein Brahim Taha, as the Secretary of the organization. The minister reassured the OIC Secretary General on the conditions of the Muslim community in Sri Lanka and the steps taken by the country for economic recovery. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation Secretary General underlined the importance that the organization attaches to the well-being of Muslim communities and minorities all around the world, including in Sri Lanka. He expressed hope and willingness to work closely in the future on issues of mutual interest. Indian High Commissioner to Sri Lanka Gopal Bagle said that cooperation and working together would be very important for Sri Lanka and India on the journey that lies ahead for the two parties to celebrate the centenary of independence in 2047 for India and 2048 for Sri Lanka.
Indian High Commissioner to Sri Lanka Gopal Bagle and President Ranil Wickremesinghe took part in the Rhythm of Harmony held at the Concert Hall of the Bandaranaike Memorial International Conference Hall to mark the 74th Republic Day of India.
In a few days from now, indeed just about 10 days, Sri Lanka is also going to mark its 75th Independence Day. So we thought, as neighbors and friends, let us celebrate this together. In our part of the world, in our civilizations, the common values that I refer to, they imply that we share each other's happiness so that happiness can multiply, and we stand with each other in difficulties so that the burden can be shared. And therefore, here I especially recall and remember the advice which the Honorable President had given speaking at a public forum on India's Independence Day last year, where he had advised the young leaders of Sri Lanka to know and be familiar with their Indian counterparts. Because, as he had said, that cooperation, that working together will be very important for both countries. It's not only political leaders, it's not only professionals, it's not only scientists, it's not only diplomats or bureaucrats or civil servants. It's every section of the society which will have to play a very crucial role in common prosperity, shared prosperity that we are going to forge with everybody's participation.
The Chinese embassy has clarified that a letter being widely circulated on social media since of late, claiming that China is unable to amortize Sri Lanka's debt, is not one that was officially issued by the embassy in Colombo. Taking to Twitter, the embassy noted that the letter in question is printed on an official letterhead and is completely forged. The embassy urged all persons to follow only official sources of information. A letter dated the 18th of January 2023 was recently widely circulated on social media on an official letterhead of the Chinese embassy in Sri Lanka, addressed to the President Ranil Wickremesinghe. And to talk about whether China requires Sri Lanka to give them special treatment on debt restructuring, we have the Sri Lankan ambassador in China joining us after this break.
It's hard to keep up with the new when you're listening to the same old Slim Bread Week. A week for professionals.
Welcome back to the news. We've been talking about Sri Lanka working with international creditors, the Paris Club, and other bilateral creditors in order to secure financial debt assurances as a precursor to obtain the International Monetary Fund, EFF, of $2.9 billion. We've been awaiting assurances from both India and China. Earlier last week, we heard from India. We saw a letter that India had sent to the IMF. And just days back, China too extended their support to Sri Lanka and extended their support in terms of a 2-year moratorium for Sri Lanka's debt to the country. I've invited to our studios to talk more on the question of China and how Sri Lanka can work to enhance relations with China, at the same time balance other powers. Sri Lankan ambassador to China, Dr. Palitha Kohona. A very warm welcome to you. Ayubowan.
Happy to be here, Ayubowan.
Ayubowan. Thank you very much, Dr. Kohona, for being here. You're briefly visiting Sri Lanka, but tell us how the response is from Chinese authorities. There has been a bit of controversy in how Sri Lanka is going to treat the outstanding debt of China. The Chinese Exim Bank has lent Sri Lanka some $2.83 billion, which is about 3.5% of total Sri Lankan debt. But you've continuously said Sri Lanka's debt to China is less than 10% of overall debt. What is the status of the outstanding debt that is to be dealt with? And will China work with the International Monetary Fund as per information and engagements you've had with the authorities there, Dr. Kohona?
China has said publicly that it will work with Sri Lanka in addressing Sri Lanka's financial problems. And I have no doubt that they will do it with all sincerity. So the details are not available to us at this stage as to what has happened in the discussions with our financial people and the Chinese financial people. But I'm confident that China will comply, will stay with what it has already said in public which is basically that they will work with Sri Lanka in addressing Sri Lanka's difficult financial situation.
There have been questions about treating China as an equal creditor of the island, that there be equitable debt treatment. Why are these controversies? Where are they coming from? There is fear among the Indians and the Americans that China will have the upper hand in obtaining advantage over Sri Lanka's situation. Has there been any demands?
How much advantage can China have in this situation? China, we owe only about 10% of our external debt to China. We owe much more to international financial institutions. So what is the advantage that China can get in this situation?
Asking Sri Lanka to deal with China and other creditors fairly, do you think there have been any requests from the Chinese side to you or any other authorities?
No, but there's been no request to act in a particular manner or not act in a particular manner. We know that Sri Lankan financial authorities are talking to the Chinese financial authorities, and we expect that some resolution will be reached sooner or later.
Just days back, China did say through China's Exim Bank that they will provide support to Sri Lanka's bailout package. Now, this also comes with a 2-year moratorium, debt moratorium. With that, do you think China will be wary of lending Sri Lanka more funds where necessary?
That remains to be seen, because we do not know where we will come out of all these talks. And then, of course, there are some very hard negotiations to be pursued. So let's hope that the negotiations will result in an outcome that is satisfactory from Sri Lanka's perspective.
China has been a major partner of infrastructure development and investments. Going forward, do you see China working or collaborating with Sri Lanka for new projects, given that Sri Lanka is managing and has to deal with this debt issue and requiring assurances from other countries?
There are two elements here. One is state-to-state funding provided by China. And in the area of infrastructure, in the past, China has extended a considerable amount of funding and assistance to Sri Lanka to build roads, highways, harbors, airports, etc. Then there is also the private sector investment. Previously, that was not a major part of Chinese funding flowing into Sri Lanka, but in the future, we hope that private sector investment will play a big role, because China now has considerable amount of surplus investment capacity. It also has expertise in a large number of areas. I have been around China and I've seen their technological prowess. So now the effort is to encourage Chinese companies to invest in Sri Lanka, so that there will be industrial investment undertaken by Chinese in Sri Lanka, not only to supply the local market, but also to supply the regional market, and perhaps even supply China itself. China is becoming a relatively expensive place to manufacture certain items, and it will be in the interests of Chinese companies to make use of a location like Sri Lanka to produce for the Chinese market, in addition, of course, to the other markets that they already supply. So this is an area that we will be focusing on, encouraging Chinese companies, especially the bigger companies, to invest in Sri Lanka for production facilities to supply the global market from Sri Lanka.
Has there been any interest or already projects ongoing, discussions ongoing related to that?
Well, I must say that we have been discussing with a number of Chinese companies about the possibility of producing solar panels in Sri Lanka, steel in Sri Lanka, fertilizer in Sri Lanka, etc. But these discussions have not reached their final stages, and I hope that we will be able to encourage many Chinese companies to locate their offshore facilities in Sri Lanka.
Just last year, we ended close to 750,000 tourists throughout the entire year, which is far less than what we'd expect, but better than anticipated given the challenges Sri Lanka faced amidst an economic crisis, a fuel crisis. But China is now open, no restrictions, COVID-related restrictions. So how do you assess the potential for the growth of Chinese travel market in Sri Lanka?
China was, before 2020 to in 2019, the biggest source of tourists in the world. 169 million Chinese traveled somewhere. Unfortunately, at the time, we received only about 265,000 tourists. Absolutely inadequate compared with 26 million Chinese tourists in Thailand, 4.5 million in Singapore, 2.5 million in Australia, despite the tensions between China and Australia. We should have received more, and now we are working very hard at the embassy to encourage Chinese to think of Sri Lanka as their primary destination for their holidays. If we can get even a fraction of the Chinese who intend to travel this year and the next year, I think many of our problems will be resolved.
Many of our problems will be resolved.
Yeah.
But what's really keeping the Chinese tourists away from Sri Lanka? If they travel so much, so in such large numbers back in 2019, what did we not do to attract that number to Sri Lanka?
I think that's a very interesting question, and we need to examine where we faltered. My personal views are there, but I think we need to promote Sri Lanka more, promote it as a friendly destination, a destination where they can come with themselves and with their families and take back happy memories. I think traditionally Sri Lanka focused on the European market, and that market is very different to a Chinese market. Just to give you one example, Chinese are not particularly attracted to the beaches. Chinese like to keep their skins light rather than tanned. So we need to move away from that Europe-based promotion of Sri Lanka to a different way of promoting Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka has high mountains covered with tea, and the Chinese love our tea. We have gems and jewelry, which are very popular with the Chinese. Then, of course, we have the historic religious connection with China, the Buddhist connection. And wherever I had traveled, and I've traveled to 16 provinces, there is an urge to travel somewhere. Now that China has opened up, thousands of Chinese, hundreds of thousands, will immediately head to some destination overseas. And what we need to do is to promote Sri Lanka from the perspective of the Chinese and get them to come here as their preferred destination. And as you know, China at state level has listed 20 countries for Chinese tourists to travel to, Chinese groups to travel to. And then Sri Lanka is one of them. So out of the 20 listed, Sri Lanka is one of them. And I'm very pleased that our efforts have paid off to some extent. But now we can't rest on our laurels. We'll have to work harder to ensure that thousands of Chinese tourists will visit Sri Lanka and spend the yuan or dollars or whatever they have in this country, so that the hotels will be filled up again and employment will be generated, and most importantly, foreign exchange will flow into our exchequer. I would also like to mention that we are in the middle of the Chinese New Year. The year of the rabbit is just about to begin, and thousands, millions of Chinese will travel at this time to visit their families or on holiday. So I take this opportunity to wish all my Chinese friends a very happy New Year and a prosperous year of the rabbit. Tunyang Kwaila.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kohona, for your time here at our studios.
Thank you very much for this opportunity.
We had with us Dr. Pahalita Kohona, Ambassador of Sri Lanka in Beijing, joining us here in Colombo during a brief visit to the country. Welcome back to the news. The Colombo Stock Exchange reverted to green after profit-taking during yesterday's session following the outcome of the central bank policy review meeting. Now the index dipped shortly into the market opening, with investors reacting to policy rates being maintained at their current levels while profit-taking continued on treasury counters. Subsequently, investors bought into LIOC shares following the healthy results of the company, which reversed the ASPI momentum. The main index recovered losses made during the day and closed in green at 8,938, gaining 36 points, led by the contribution from LIOC and LOLC. Turnover improved compared to the last session and recorded at 2 billion rupees, with a major contribution of 42% from materials sector. Foreign participation in the market activity remained at subdued levels, with foreigners closing as net sellers. Crude oil prices inched higher yesterday as optimism for a demand recovery in China and expectations that major producers will maintain current output policy offset global recession worries. Meanwhile, OPEC Plus nations scheduled to meet next week are expected to endorse its current output level.
Brent crude rose 0.2% to $86.30 per barrel by 7:40 a.m. GMT after falling 2.3% in the prior session. US West Texas Intermediate crude climbed 0.1% to $80.20 after a 1.8% drop yesterday. Analysts said the reopening of the Chinese economy after years of tough COVID-19 restrictions could unleash a large wave of pent-up demand over the next 18 months. An OPEC Plus panel is likely to endorse the producer group's current oil output policy when it meets next week, as hopes for higher Chinese demand are balanced by worries over inflation and the global economy. However, gains in oil prices were capped by a bigger-than-expected build in the US oil inventories that was reported after the market settled yesterday. US crude stocks rose by 3.4 million barrels in the week ended on the 20th of January, according to market sources, citing American Petroleum Institute figures. Markets are also watching out for interest rate decisions from central banks for more trading cues.
Asian equities scaled their highest levels in 7 months today after some regional markets reopened after holidays and the Australian dollar hit multi-month highs as surging inflation made higher interest rates more likely. Analysts claim that stocks have been posting strong gains this year, with many expecting inflation to peak in the near future.
MSCI's broadest index of Asia-Pacific shares outside Japan rose 0.2% to a 7-month high, but traded below the day's peak. South Korean shares gained 1.3%, Nikkei put on 0.4%, and Singapore jumped 1.6%. European markets were headed for a weak opening, with Eurostoxx 50 futures down 0.3%, German DAX futures eased 0.2% lower, and FTSE futures were steady. E-mini futures for the S&P 500 shed 0.5%, and Nasdaq futures lost 0.8%. Globally, stocks have posted strong gains this year after a torrid 2022 based on expectations that inflation is close to peaking and the rise in the US interest rates will taper off. The dismantling of COVID-19 controls in China and the reopening of its borders have further boosted investor sentiment. The MSCI's Asia Index has rallied 9% so far this year after slumping nearly 20% in 2022. MSCI's All-Country World Index eked out a fresh 5-month closing high yesterday. Stronger than expected economic data in Europe eased market worries of a sharp recession there, but interest rates are still seen creeping higher despite declining energy prices reducing inflationary pressure.
Well, that wraps up tonight's edition of First at 9. Thank you for watching. Have a pleasant evening. Good night.